Welcome to the debate. Today we're tackling a really massive conceptual question about how we fundamentally analyze American history.
Right, it's a structural question, really.
Exactly. We're asking, is the United States at its absolute core a unilateral structural force of subjugation and exclusion? Or, is it ultimately defined by the perpetual tension between that founding force and the revolutionary movements that continually challenge it?
And to ground this, we are anchoring our analysis in a really revealing piece of source material. It's a recorded dialogue between Mike Green, who is a co-founder of Common Ground Conversations on Race in America, and his 15-year-old son, Josiah.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note this isn't your standard sanitized historical overview.
Oh, definitely not. It's a stark, chronological interrogation. It tracks the nation from its establishment in 1776, right through the Civil War and Reconstruction, all the way to the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, which the text explicitly refers to as the Negro Revolution, and then right up to the present day.
Mm-hmm.
Through this dialogue, Green really forces us to ask what the word America actually means functionally, rather than just ideologically.
He really does. And I'll be arguing that Green's source material proves America is most accurately defined as that continuous structural force of white male domination. When you strip away the mythology, you're left with an entity that is functioning exactly as it was originally designed to.
And, well, I will be arguing that while Green's text absolutely exposes that oppressive structural force, the very evidence he relies on, specifically regarding the 14th Amendment and the ongoing civil rights movements, demonstrates something far more complex.
Okay.
I'll argue that America is far more accurately defined by the ideological struggle and the massive counterforces actively dismantling that original framework.
Well, let's start by looking at how Green strips away the romanticism right at the beginning of his conversation with Josiah. He clarifies that a country is not just a landmass.
Right. A landmass is just inert dirt.
Exactly. A country is a force. It requires military, institutional, and legal machinery to conquer territory and establish boundaries. In 1776, sovereignty wasn't achieved through peaceful debate.
No, it was violent.
It was achieved through violent force by white men breaking away from a British monarch. But the crucial part, the really defining element, is what they did with that machinery once they had it. They created an explicitly whites-only national citizenship.
And Green points specifically to the 1790 Naturalization Act for that, right?
He does, and this is vital. This was the very first law to establish uniform rules for granting U.S. citizenship. And the sole criteria? You had to be a free white person.
Which is a legal reality that essentially sets the stage for everything that follows in the text.
Exactly. So think of this in terms of an operating system. White supremacy in this text isn't a bug in the American software. It is the original source code. It was intentionally designed to function this way and to aggressively expand its power.
Expanding from the original colonies, you mean?
Right. Green points out a fascinating and frankly brutal mathematical reality to his son. In the 1860s, there were 37 states. By the 1960s, there were 50 states.
Wow, yeah.
How does a nation add 13 states? That difference represents the calculated systemic confiscation of native lands and the subjugation of non-white populations. The system wasn't broken. It was executing its programming flawlessly, moving across the continent by force. America, by this reading, is fundamentally that exclusionary force.
I mean, it is a devastatingly effective framework, but defining America solely as this unbroken, oppressive machine entirely ignores the massive, nation-saving counterforces that are detailed in Green's own dialogue.
How so?
Well, if we stick to your operating system analogy, you are ignoring the massive systemic crashes and the moments where the users fundamentally rewrote the kernel of that source code. Yes, the 1790 Naturalization Act established a whites-only citizenship. I don't dispute that.
Mm-hmm.
But look at where Green spends a massive portion of this conversation, the Civil War era. He points out a stunning paradox. The white citizens who had established this system, the ones who benefited from the source code, actually seceded from it.
They waged a war against their own creation.
Exactly. They waged war against the United States. And who saved the Republic? Green notes that 200,000 black men fought on the front lines.
Right.
And another 300,000 black men and women served in support roles.
And the text quotes Lincoln himself, admitting the Union could not have won without them.
Precisely. We really need to unpack the magnitude of that. They literally saved the United States from the white citizens who had built it. And the consequence of that salvation was the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868.
The legal update.
But it wasn't just a minor legal update. It fundamentally rewrote that original source code you mentioned. It granted citizenship to all persons born on U.S. soil. It legally erased the free white person mandate of 1790.
On paper, yes.
But legally, structurally, therefore, defining America merely as a white exclusionary force diminishes the profound reality that the nation was violently contested, physically saved, and legally redefined by black Americans. The tension, the struggle itself, is the definition of America.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Because if you're looking at the 14th Amendment and thinking the system fundamentally changed, you have to look at how a system like this actually absorbs a legal loss.
Okay, go on.
The text shows us how incredibly resilient the original source code is. When you try to install a program the system wasn't built for, like, say, multiracial democracy, the system doesn't just crash. Its antivirus protocol actively attacks the new program.
To maintain its base functions?
Exactly. Green points out a staggering historical juxtaposition. In 1868, the very same year that the 14th Amendment was ratified, what happens? President Andrew Johnson issues a blanket pardon on Christmas Day to the violent insurrectionists who had just tried to overthrow the government.
He forgives the treason.
He forgives it completely. The aha moment here isn't just that Johnson pardoned them, it's that structural power will violently oppose reform, but it will immediately forgive treason if the treason protects the original system.
That is a very dark way to frame it.
But it's what the text shows. The very people who had waged a bloody war to preserve slavery were welcomed back into the fold. And it didn't stop with the president. Congress followed suit just 4 years later with the 1872 Amnesty Act.
Right, restoring their political rights.
Exactly. Think about the mechanics of power here. Despite the heroic actions of those 500,000 black individuals you mentioned, the dominant white power structure immediately bypassed its own constitutional evolution to protect its own. The 1872 Amnesty Act was the system isolating and deleting the threat of equality.
I come at it from a different way. Because if the system is as monolithic and smooth running as you say, how do you explain the sheer friction of that moment?
Friction?
Yeah. You're looking at the 1868 pardons and the 1872 Amnesty Act as proof of an unbroken, unyielding force. But look at what it took to execute those pardons. The effort required to re-empower those insurrectionists actually proves that the original whites-only force was fatally threatened.
But it successfully defended itself.
Did it do so smoothly? Green makes a very specific point to tell Josiah that Andrew Johnson opposed the 14th Amendment and was impeached for his actions. He survived removal from office by just one vote. One single vote.
True, but he did survive.
He survived, yes, but a monolithic system doesn't impeach its own leader and miss removing him by a single vote. That is a system in absolute crisis. The state was fighting itself.
It was fractured.
Deeply fractured. It was struggling against a new, multiracial reality that was violently forcing its way into existence. When Abraham Lincoln, the head of the American state, admits that the military power of the nation depended entirely on the formerly enslaved, it proves the power dynamics had fundamentally changed.
Irreversibly changed, do you think?
I do. The counterforce wasn't just a protest anymore. It had become the saving grace of the state itself.
Well, let's follow the logical consequences of that fracture then, because the resolution to that crisis leads us to a very, very dark place in Green's text. Let's look at how that crisis was resolved and what that re-empowerment achieved.
You're talking about the end of Reconstruction.
I am. Because the insurrectionists were allowed back into the political machinery, we arrive at the tie for the presidency in 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. This sets up what Green calls the Great Compromise of 1877. We really need to unpack the mechanism of this trade-off.
The backroom deal that gave the Northern Republicans the White House in exchange for removing federal troops from the South.
Right, but Greene asks Josiah a pivotal question that we have to answer here. Why were those federal troops in the South to begin with?
To enforce Reconstruction.
Right, they were stationed there specifically to protect the newly freed Black population from mass uprisings and violence by angry white citizens. The Northern whites literally traded away the physical safety of Black citizens for the political power of the presidency.
It was a horrific betrayal.
And the results were catastrophic. Greene cites congressional records stating that from 1877, when the troops left, up to the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling, which legally codified two unequal societies, 53,000 Black people were killed.
God.
53,000 deaths in just 19 years. One single generation.
The sheer scale of that violence is horrifying.
It's beyond horrifying, it's revealing. Greene asks his son, what did America mean to them? The answer is danger, theft, death, and destruction.
Yeah.
You argue that America is defined by tension and evolution, but when the rubber meets the road, the dominant force trades Black lives for political expediency. It results in mass slaughter and the theft of land and wealth. How can we define America as anything other than this exclusionary force when its institutions so ruthlessly sacrifice their own citizens?
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the paradox you just introduced? I mean, if you're listening to this and feeling the absolute weight of that betrayal, you are entirely right to feel that. I hold absolute respect for the gravity of Greene's data.
It's a staggering death toll.
A staggering, indefensible indictment of the state. But we cannot gloss over the nuance here. Why were those troops there to begin with?
Like I said, they were there for Reconstruction, but they abandoned that mission.
They did abandon them, yes. And it was a catastrophic moral and institutional failure. But the fact that they were deployed at all is massive.
How so?
The United States government actively used its monopoly on violence, its own military, to suppress white supremacist insurgencies and protect Black citizens. If America is purely and simply a monolithic force of white domination, those troops are never stationed there in the first place.
They eventually left, though.
Yes, but a purely white supremacist machine doesn't deploy the army against white supremacists for a decade. The tragedy of 1877 happens precisely because the definition of America was deeply contested territory. The Northern whites capitulated, but the fact that a compromise had to be struck at all shows that the white supremacist framework was no longer the undisputed default. It had to negotiate for its survival.
But that negotiation didn't just ensure its survival, it ensured its total dominance for the next century. The tension you're talking about always ends with the system reasserting itself.
Not entirely.
Let me just connect the violence of the post-1877 era to the modern day, which Greene does meticulously. He jumps from the continuous confiscation of native lands to the 1960s, introducing a phrase we really need to discuss. He calls it the 1963 Negro Revolution.
Let's pause and clarify that terminology for a second, because Greene's use of the phrase Negro Revolution instead of just civil rights movement is highly intentional here.
Very intentional.
He uses it to describe the sheer scale of the disruption. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and millions of others engaging in nonviolent direct action across nearly 1,000 cities. He's framing it not just as a request for civil rights, but as a structural revolution aimed at the core of the American system.
Exactly. It was a massive counterforce making structural demands. And what were those demands? They were highly specific. They demanded an end to racial segregation in schools, an end to discrimination in housing, and an end to discrimination in banking and access to capital.
Education, shelter, and wealth.
The absolute pillars of participation in any society. And what does Greene tell his son about the response to those demands?
He tells Josiah that the power structure did not put an end to those things.
He says they were entirely rebuffed. The institutional machinery said no. In fact, he emphasizes that in all three categories, schools, housing, and capital, conditions have actually worsened today compared to 1963.
That is a very sobering point in the text.
This is the crux of my position. You can point to the heroism of the Black soldiers in the Civil War, or the temporary presence of Union troops during Reconstruction, or the bravery of the marchers in 1963. But if the fundamental demands for equity are entirely denied by the institutional power,
Denied at the structural level.
right, and if those conditions are measurably worse today than they were half a century ago, then the tension you're talking about is an illusion. The continuity of denial is definitive proof of an unyielding, unchanging institutional force. It's a system that absorbs the protest, maybe changes a few laws on paper, but it does not change its fundamental nature.
I hear your logic, but I cannot accept that conclusion. You are equating a lack of total final victory with a lack of fundamental impact.
If the conditions are worse, what is the impact?
You argue that the tension is an illusion. But Green's own conclusion to this Socratic dialogue entirely refutes that idea. He tells his son that the Negro Revolution, led by Dr. King, continues to this day.
Because it has to.
Yes, but if the white male power structure was absolute, unquestioned, and unyielding, that revolution would have been fully extinguished in 1968 with the assassination of King. It would have been erased. But it wasn't.
It continues because the oppressive conditions it is fighting against still exist, largely unchanged.
Yes, the oppressive conditions exist, but so does the organized, multi-generational resistance to them. Look at the final, most important exchange in the entire text.
Right, the closing question.
Yeah. After walking through all of this harrowing history, Green asks his 15-year-old son a very direct question. He asks, can we change the course of this country? And Josiah doesn't hesitate. He says yes.
He does.
Green agrees with him. He says, yes, we can, but it will take lessons from the past to understand how we can change the course of the future. The belief that the future can be changed, the active, enduring resistance, the literal passing down of this unvarnished history from a father to a son, that is an active force in its own right.
It's a localized force, though.
But it's foundational. To define America only by the oppressor ignores the agency, the power, and the profound resilience of the people who have continually forced the country to look in the mirror. That resistance is just as foundational to the definition of America as the systemic oppression it fights against.
Well, I will say it is deeply moving that Green ends on that note of possibility. He's equipping his son with reality rather than myth, which is powerful. And I think that brings us to the core of where we stand on this analysis.
I think so too.
When we look at the through line established in this text, the mechanism of the 1790 Naturalization Act, building the exclusionary base code, the instantaneous pardoning of violent insurrectionists in 1868 to protect that code, the brutal political arithmetic of the 1877 Compromise.
Trading 53,000 black lives for political power.
Exactly. All the way to the unfulfilled, entirely rebuffed demands of the 1963 Civil Rights Movement. The empirical picture painted by Green is staggering. It is the portrait of a nation functioning primarily as a dominating exclusionary force, ruthlessly protecting its foundational source code of white male authority.
And I maintain that while the existence and sheer brutality of that force is undeniable in the text, you simply cannot erase the counter-narrative that runs parallel to it and frequently disrupts it.
The tension?
The tension. The actions of 500,000 black individuals during the Civil War who physically saved the Republic. The subsequent ratification of the 14th Amendment that fundamentally altered the Constitution. The deployment of federal troops to fight white supremacy. And the enduring, ongoing Negro Revolution that continues to demand equity today.
You see those as equal forces.
I see them as inseparable. These are not footnotes. They prove that America is equally defined by those who continually force it to evolve, who challenge its original design, and who refuse to let the oppressive machinery operate unchallenged.
Well, it seems we remain divided on which framework ultimately holds more weight in defining the nation's core identity. But I think we can entirely agree that holding both of these perspectives simultaneously is essential.
Oh, absolutely.
You simply cannot understand the profound generational scope of the revolutionary counterforce without deeply grasping the sheer brutal weight of the structural force it is constantly pushing against.
Perfectly said. You need to understand both mechanisms to grasp the reality of the material. Green's entire purpose in sharing this unvarnished history with Josiah is to ensure the next generation understands exactly what machinery they are up against so they can effectively dismantle it and change the course of the future.
Right. There is clearly much more to explore in this history than any single conversation can hold.
Without a doubt.
Indeed. So we leave it to you listening to reflect on this tension. History. Do you see a system perfectly executing an exclusionary, unyielding code, or do you see a nation defined by the relentless, ongoing struggle of those fighting to rewrite it? Thank you for joining us.